Excuse me, mister. Why do the rich people always look at me and my grandmama like we're made of invisible glass? Is it because being poor is a disease you're afraid to catch? Her little voice sounded in my ears like thunder rumbling, so bold and clear. I have ordered the deaths of men who blinked at the wrong time. I have moved millions of dollars across borders without breaking a single sweat. But in all my years of running these streets, I have never felt as small as I did when a 7-year-old girl looked at my $5,000 suit and asked me the one question I couldn't answer. My name is Jim to the world. I am the shadow behind this city's most dangerous contracts. People call me a monster, they call me a ghost, but in that moment, looking at her worn-out shoes, the soles held together by nothing but a prayer and some duct tape, I realized my entire empire was built on sand. She wasn't asking for a handout. She wasn't begging for a dollar. She was asking for a reason to exist. And for the first time in my 40 years, I decided to stop being a boss and start being a man. I didn't know it then, but that little girl and the woman who made those shoes were about to dismantle my world more than any bullet ever could. What do you think will happen next? Don't skip yet because the story just got started. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comment and also hit the subscribe button. Now let's unwrap what the story holds. The air in the park was thin, biting. The kind of cold that doesn't just chill your skin but settles deep into your marrow. I sat on a bench that cost more than most people's monthly rent, adjusted the silk tie at my throat, and waited for a contact who was already 10 minutes late. In my world, 10 minutes is a lifetime. 10 minutes is long enough for a deal to go sour or a hit to be executed. But then, I heard it. Not the sound of a suppressed pistol or the screech of tires. It was the rhythmic, desperate flap, flap, flap of a shoe falling apart. I didn't look up at first. I kept my gaze fixed on the skyline, the glass towers of the city reflecting a sunset I had no soul left to enjoy. Then she sat down, not near me, but close enough that I could smell the scent of cheap laundry detergent and old leather. "You have very shiny shoes, mister," the voice said. It was small, light, but carried a weight that didn't belong to a child. I turned my head slowly. She was maybe 7. Her skin was a deep, rich mahogany, glowing even in the fading light. But it was her eyes. They weren't the eyes of a child. They were the eyes of a person who had already seen the bottom of the well. And then she asked it, the question that stopped my heart for a beat. Why do the rich dislike associating with the poor? Because that's what happens to me and my grandmama every day. We walk past people, and they look through us like we're just air. I looked at her feet. The flap I heard was the sole of her left shoe. It was a beautiful design, an intricate hand-stitched leather pattern, but it was ancient, worn down to nothing. "It's not that they dislike you," I said, my voice sounding like gravel under a boot. "It's that they're afraid. They think if they look too long, they'll realize how easily they could end up just like you." She didn't flinch. She just nodded as if I'd confirmed a math equation she'd been working on. "My grandmama says people aren't invisible, only their hearts are. She makes the best shoes in the world, but nobody sees them. They only see her chair." She stood up then, the broken shoe flapping against the pavement as she walked away toward a bus stop. I should have stayed for my meeting. I should have focused on the $3 million currently moving through my accounts. But instead, I signaled my driver. "Follow them," I whispered into my collar. I watched from the tinted windows of my SUV as she met an older woman at the bus stop. This was Ruth. She sat in a manual wheelchair, her hands wrapped in thin bandages, her face a map of elegance and exhaustion. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like a queen who had been stripped of her throne but kept her crown. They lived in a part of the city where the streetlights didn't work. a place where the paint peeled like sunburnt skin. I watched as the little girl, Zuri, pushed her grandmother's chair up a makeshift wooden ramp into a cramped apartment. Inside, through the window, I didn't see a den of poverty. I saw a workshop. Hundreds of pieces of leather, tools polished to a shine, and rows of the most exquisite footwear I had ever seen, all gathering dust. I realized then that I wasn't looking at a charity case. I was looking at an asset, a way to turn my blood-soaked money into something beautiful, something real. It wasn't kindness, not yet. It was a strategy. Find out everything, I told my assistant, Silas. The accident, the debt, the medical records. I want to know why a woman who can craft gold with her hands is living in a tomb. As we drove away, I looked at my own reflection. I was the Mafia boss. I was the man people feared. But as I thought about Zuri's question, I felt a strange, uncomfortable itch in my chest. For the first time, I didn't want to be invisible. 3 days later, I was standing in a room that smelled of cedar, glue, and a history I didn't understand. Ruth didn't look up when I entered. She was hunched over a workbench, a single lamp illuminating a piece of calfskin she was molding. "We're closed," she said. Her voice was like velvet dipped in iron. "Unless you're looking for the pawn shop next door. You're wearing too much money to be in this neighborhood, sir." "I'm not looking for a pawn shop," I said, stepping into the light. "I'm looking for the woman who made the shoes the little girl in the park was wearing." Ruth froze. She slowly turned her chair, her eyes narrowing as she took me in. She didn't see a savior. She saw a predator. "What did she do if she touched your car, if she bothered you? She's just a child." "She asked me a question," I replied, leaning against a stack of crates. "And I've decided I want to pay for the answer. My name is Jim. I own various interests in this city, and I've noticed that your talent is being wasted in a room that's rotting around you." I laid a folder on her bench. It contained the deed to a factory in the garment district, a clean, state-of-the-art facility. "I don't take charity," Ruth said, her voice dropping an octave. "I had a life before the accident. I had a shop. I had a name. I lost it all because the world doesn't have time for a woman who can't walk. I don't need a handout from a man who smells like whatever it is you do." She knew. She wasn't stupid. She could see the darkness in the cut of my suit. "It's not a handout, Ruth," I said, stepping closer. "It's a merger. I have capital that needs to be moved into legitimate ventures. I have the logistics, the shipping, and the teeth to make sure no one ever ignores you again. You have the genius. I want to build a brand. Ruth and Zuri, the finest handcrafted shoes in the Western world." "And what do you get?" she asked, her eyes searching mine. "I get a legacy," I said, and for once I wasn't lying. "And I get to make sure that little girl never has to ask why she's invisible again. I want to adopt her, legally, to ensure she has my name, my protection, and my resources. You keep the creative control. I keep the predators away." The silence stretched. I could hear the clock on the wall ticking like a heartbeat. Ruth looked at her hands, scarred, calloused, but steady. Then she looked at a photo of Zuri pinned to the wall. "You're a dangerous man, Mr. Jim," she whispered. "I am," I admitted. "But I'm the only dangerous man who's offering to build you a kingdom instead of burning one down." "One condition," she said, pointing a needle at me. "You don't save us. We work, we earn. If this fails, we walk away or I roll away. Deal." "Deal," I said. As I left, Zuri was standing in the hallway. She looked at me, then at the folder on the table. She didn't smile. She just reached out and touched the sleeve of my coat. "You came back," she whispered. "I told you," I said, kneeling so I was at her level. "I'm tired of being invisible too." Transitioning a criminal empire into a luxury fashion house is like trying to turn a shark into a swan. It's messy, and someone usually gets bitten. Now the new facility was breathtaking. White walls, floor-to-ceiling windows, and the best equipment money and a little intimidation could buy. But the atmosphere was tense. Ruth was a perfectionist. She didn't care about deadlines or profit margins. She cared about the grain of the leather. "This is garbage," Ruth yelled, tossing a hide at one of my men. A guy named Victor who usually handled debt collection but was now, hilariously, in charge of sourcing materials. "It's top grade, ma'am," Victor stammered, looking at me for help. I stayed in the shadows, watching. This was the conscious choice starting to take root. I could have forced her to work faster, I could have replaced her, but I found myself fascinated by her integrity. She was teaching my men who only knew destruction, how to create. But the mafia side of my life wasn't letting go so easily. My phone buzzed. It was a blocked number. "The board wants to know why you're playing house with cobblers, Zium. You're missing the sit-downs. You're moving money into leather and silk instead of the usual shipments. It looks weak." I looked out into the factory floor. Zuri was there, wearing a tiny lab coat, helping Ruth organize the thread. She looked happy. For the first time, she was wearing shoes that fit, shoes that didn't flap when she walked. "Strength is defined by what you can build, not what you can break," I whispered into the phone before hanging up. That night I took Zuri home to the new house I'd bought for them, a brownstone with a lift for Ruth. As I was leaving, Zuri stopped me. "Zium," she asked. It was the first time she used my name. "Are you my daddy now?" The word hit me like a physical blow. I've been called a boss, a king, a devil. But daddy, I wasn't ready for that. "I'm your guardian, Zuri. It's a business arrangement," I said, my voice cracking just a little. "Oh," she said, her face falling slightly. "Grandmama says business is for people who are afraid to love things. I think you're just practicing." I drove away that night with a target on my back. My old life was coming for me, and my new life was demanding a heart I wasn't sure I possessed. The convenience of this arrangement was disappearing, replaced by something much more terrifying, a reason to stay alive. Suddenly, a black sedan pulled up alongside my SUV. The window rolled down. A gun barrel glinted in the streetlights. They thought they could hurt me by coming for my life, but they made a mistake. They should have come for me, because by touching that factory, by threatening that little girl, they didn't just wake up the boss. They woke up a father who had nothing left to lose. The transition from the underworld to the high-end fashion world wasn't just about changing clothes. It was about changing a soul. I spent my mornings in the factory, watching Ruth command my former enforcers like they were apprentices. It was a sight that would have been laughable if it wasn't so transformative. Victor, a man who once broke fingers for a living, was now sitting under a magnifying glass, learning how to hand burnish the edges of a stiletto heel. "Softly, Victor," Ruth would say, her voice echoing through the sterile white halls. "If you rush the leather, it will scream. You have to listen to it." I stood on the mezzanine, watching them. I felt like a ghost in my own building. My phone was a constant weight in my pocket, a vibrating reminder that the Board of Shadows was losing patience. They didn't understand the long game. They only understood the immediate harvest of fear. Zuri found me up there. She was carrying a sketchbook, her own little world of drawings. She leaned against the railing next to me, her head barely reaching my elbow. "Why do you stay up here, Zium?" she asked. "Are you hiding?" "I'm watching," I said, not looking down. "A boss has to see everything." "My grandmama says you're not watching the shoes," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the floor below. "She says you're watching to see if we're going to disappear. We aren't going anywhere unless you tell us to." Her innocence was a blade. She didn't realize that in my world, people only stayed as long as they were useful. But as I looked at her, I realized my definition of useful had shifted. She wasn't an asset because of what she could do, she was an asset because of what she made me feel. For the first time in 20 years, I wasn't thinking about the next hit or the next shipment. I was thinking about the school play she had mentioned that morning. But the piece was a lie. Later that afternoon, a man named Hannel, a high-ranking lieutenant from my former life, walked into the lobby. He didn't belong in a place this clean. He smelled of expensive cigarettes and cheap intentions. "Zium," he said, looking around the polished marble foyer. "The brothers are talking. They say you've traded your spine for a pair of high heels. They're worried, Zium. When the head of the dragon starts acting like a lamb, the rest of the body starts to starve." "Tell the brothers I'm diversifying," I said, my voice as cold as a winter morning in Seoul. "And tell them if any of them set foot in this building again without an appointment, they won't be walking out, on shoes or otherwise." Hannel laughed, but his eyes stayed dead. "You're making a mistake, Zium. You think you can buy a new life. Blood doesn't wash out of leather, it just stains it." He left, but the air felt heavy. I walked back into the workshop. Ruth was looking at me. She didn't say anything, but she didn't have to. She knew the wolf was at the door. She reached out and placed a hand on mine, her skin rough from years of work, but her touch was the only thing that felt real in that entire city. "We aren't afraid, Zium," she said softly. "We've lived through worse than men in suits." "I know," I replied, "but I am. I'm afraid of what I'll have to become again to keep this place safe." The launch of the first collection was 6 weeks away. We were calling it the Mahogany Walk. It wasn't just about luxury, it was about the resilience of the artisan. Ruth had designed a signature stitch, a hidden, double-looped gold thread that reinforced the heel. She called it the unbroken line. I spent more time at the brownstone now. It was a strange relationship of convenience that was starting to feel suspiciously like a home. We ate dinner together, Ruth at the head of the table in her chair, Zuri chattering about her day, and me trying to figure out how to be a person. "Zium, you have to eat the greens," Zuri insisted, piling broccoli onto my plate. "If you want to be strong for the big show, you need vitamins." "I think I've lived this long without broccoli, Zuri," I joked. "That's why you look so grumpy all the time," she shot back, and even Ruth chuckled. But as the night wore on and Zuri went to bed, the atmosphere shifted. Ruth and I sat in the living room, the city lights reflecting off the windows. "Why did you really do this, Zium?" she asked. "I know it wasn't just to clean your money. You could have done that with 1,000 different businesses. Why a disabled woman and a little girl?" I looked at my hands. "Because you were the first people who didn't look at me with fear. Zuri looked at me with curiosity. And you looked at me with judgment. I realized I'd rather be judged by a woman like you than feared by 1,000 men like Hannel." "It's a heavy burden, Zium," she said. "Taking us on. We're not just a brand, we're lives." I made a choice, Ruth. A conscious one. I'm not just Zuri's guardian because of a contract. I'm her guardian because I want to see who she becomes. And I want to be the man who made that possible. The moment was broken by a sudden crash from the kitchen. I was on my feet in a second, my hand reaching for the holster at the small of my back, a habit I couldn't break. It was just a vase that had slipped off the counter. But as I stood there, gun drawn, breathing hard, I saw the look in Ruth's eyes. It wasn't fear of the intruder. It was a reminder of who I actually was. "The world won't let you just walk away, will it?" she whispered. "No," I said, slowly holstering the weapon. "But I'm going to make it very expensive for them to follow me." The next morning, the sabotage began. A shipment of premium leather from Italy was intercepted and burned. Our lead distributor received a friendly visit from Hannel's men. The message was clear. The Mafia doesn't do fashion. I sat in my office, the darkness creeping back into my mind. I could call my old crews. I could end this in a night of fire and lead. But if I did that, I'd lose the seat at Ruth's table. I'd lose the right to be daddy. I had to win this legally. I had to outsmart them. I had to use the one thing the Mafia never expected, the truth. The tension reached its breaking point when a local news outlet received an anonymous tip about the origins of the funding for Ruth and Zuri. The headline was devastating: Blood Money or High Fashion, the dark secret behind the city's newest luxury brand. The factory was surrounded by reporters within hours. My legal team was scrambling, but the damage was done. The convenience of the arrangement was now a liability for Ruth. I found her in the workshop, staring at the newspaper. Zuri was in the corner, looking confused and frightened. "Is it true?" Ruth asked, her voice trembling not with fear but with a deep, soul-crushing disappointment. "Did this money come from pain?" I stood in the doorway, the weight of my past finally crushing the present. "Yes, much of it did. I told you I was a dangerous man, Ruth. I told you I wanted to clean it." "There's a difference between cleaning money and washing it in someone else's blood, Ziam," she shouted, her voice breaking. "I built this brand on dignity. I built it on the idea that even if you're broken, you have value. How can I sell shoes to women telling them they're beautiful when the floors they're walking on were paid for by whatever it is you've done?" "I did it for you." I stepped forward, but she held up a hand. "No, you did it for yourself, to feel better about the monster in the mirror. You used us, Ziam. You used our purity to hide your rot. It wasn't a merger, it was a mask." Zuri started to cry, the sound sharp and piercing in the large room. I went to go to her, but Ruth moved her chair, blocking my path. "Don't," she said, "just leave. We'll go back to the apartment. We'll go back to the invisible glass. It was honest there. This is just a lie with a gold buckle." I walked out of that factory feeling more hollow than I ever had in the underground. I had everything: the money, the power, the facility. But I had lost the only thing that mattered. The conscious choice I had made was being stripped away by the man I used to be. I sat in my car, watching the rain hit the windshield. Silas, my assistant, looked at me through the rearview mirror. "What now, boss? We can make the story go away. We can handle the teepsters." "No," I said, my eyes hardening. "We're not going to hide anymore. If the world wants to see the Mafia boss, I'll show him to them, but not the way they think." I realized then that the only way to save Ruth's dream was to destroy my own. I had to fully divest. I had to surrender my empire to the authorities in a way that cleared the brand, even if it meant I lost my freedom. It was the ultimate relationship of convenience. Move. One final sacrifice to ensure the people I loved were no longer associated with the ghost of Ziam Jim. But as I pulled away, I saw a small figure standing at the factory gates. It was Zuri. She was holding one of the shoes Ruth had made, the one with the unbroken line. She didn't wave. She just watched me go. I had spent my whole life trying to be the man who had everything. But as I looked at that little girl in the rearview mirror, I realized that having everything meant nothing if you weren't the man she thought you were. The board was set. The shadows were closing in, and the only way out was to burn it all down. The world didn't just turn its back on us, it tried to bury us. After the headlines hit, the factory felt like a tomb. The orders were canceled, the investors vanished, and the silence between me and Ruth was louder than any gunshot I'd ever heard. I stayed away for 3 days, living out of my office, surrounded by the ghosts of my ledgers. I had two choices. I could go back to the Board of Shadows, beg for their protection, and return to a life of blood, or I could do the one thing a Mafia boss never does. I could surrender. I walked back into the factory at 3:00 a.m. I expected it to be empty, but there she was, Ruth. The dim light of a single lamp illuminated her workbench. She was stitching. Her hands were shaking, but the needle was true, the unbroken line. "You're still here," I said, my voice echoing in the darkness. "I have nowhere else to go, Ziam," she said, not looking up. "And I have a promise to keep to a 7-year-old girl. She thinks her daddy is a hero who's just having a bad day. I don't have the heart to tell her she's living in a house built on graves." I sat on a crate across from her. "I'm ending it, Ruth, all of it. I've spent the last 72 hours compiling every ledger, every name, every transaction from my past. I'm handing it over to the Federal Bureau, but I've structured it so that Ruth and Zuri is completely severed. The funding has been traced to my legitimate ancestors' estate in Jeju, money that was never touched by the streets. The factory is yours. The brand is yours. I'm stepping down. Permanently." Ruth stopped stitching. She looked at me, her eyes wet with a mix of anger and something that looked like mourning. "And what happens to you?" "I'll likely spend the next decade in a cell," I said, a strange sense of peace washing over me. "But the headlines will change. Tomorrow, the story won't be about a mafia boss's front. It will be about a man who turned state's evidence to protect the only beautiful thing he ever touched." "Why," she whispered, "why go this far for us?" "Because of the question, Ruth," I said, standing up. "Zuri asked why the rich look through the poor. I realized I was doing the same thing. I was looking through you, using you as a shield. I want to be the person who finally sees you, not as a project, not as a merger, but as my family." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. "These are the adoption papers. I've signed them. If you sign them, she'll be protected by my legal estate even while I'm away. She'll have a name that stands for something else now. Not fear, but restoration." Ruth looked at the papers, then at me. She didn't sign them immediately. She reached out and touched the unbroken line on the shoe she was making. "The stitch is strong because it loops back on itself, Ziam," she said softly. "It remembers where it started. If you do this, if you really burn your world down for her, then you're not the man the newspapers say you are." "I'm trying not to be," I said. That night, for the first time in my life, I slept without a gun under my pillow. I knew the board would be coming for me the moment they realized I'd turned. I knew the police would be at my door by dawn, but as I watched the sun rise over the city, I didn't feel like a prisoner. I felt like a man who had finally made a conscious choice. The Board of Shadows didn't wait for the police. Hannel and 4 others were waiting for me in the factory parking lot the next morning. They didn't come for a talk. They came to ensure I didn't make it to the federal building. "You're a dead man, Ziam," Hannel hissed, the barrel of a silenced pistol pressing against my ribs. "You thought you could just walk away. You thought you could trade us for a crippled woman and a brat." I looked him in the eye. I didn't feel the old coldness. I felt a strange, burning heat. "You're already late, Hannel. The files are already in the cloud. My lawyers have the key. If I don't check in by noon, the entire board goes down. You kill me, you kill yourselves." It was a gamble, a bluff. But in the underworld, a bluff is only as strong as the man behind it. Hannel hesitated. In that moment of doubt, the sirens began to wail in the distance. Not the police, the fire department. Smoke was billowing from the back of the factory. "No," I breathed. They hadn't come for me. They had set the warehouse on fire, the place where Ruth and Zuri were currently finishing the collection. I didn't think. I didn't reach for a weapon. I slammed my elbow into Hannel's throat, wrestled the gun away, and ran toward the flames. Behind me, I heard the screech of tires as the cowards fled. They didn't want a shootout with the cops. They just wanted to destroy my heart. The heat was an invisible wall. I burst through the side door. the air thick with the smell of burning leather and chemicals. "Ruth Zuri," I screamed. I found them in the main workshop. The lift had jammed due to the power failure. Ruth was on the floor, having dragged herself from her chair, shielding Zuri with her own body. The ceiling was beginning to groan. "Zium!" Zuri shrieked, her face streaked with soot. I scooped Zuri up with one arm and turned to Ruth. She was looking at her workshop, her life's work being consumed by the fire. "Leave me, Zium. Take her and go. The shoes, the machines, it's all gone." "I'm not leaving you," I grunted, bracing my legs. I didn't care about the shoes. I didn't care about the brand. I grabbed Ruth, lifting her with a strength I didn't know I had, throwing her over my shoulder while clutching Zuri to my chest. Every step felt like walking through a furnace. My suit, that $5,000 suit, was melting. My lungs were screaming. But as I burst through the exit into the cool morning air, collapsing onto the pavement as the roof caved in behind us, I realized something. The relationship of convenience was dead. It had burned in that fire. As the paramedics rushed toward us, Zuri clung to my neck, her small hands shaking. "You saved us," she sobbed. "You're the hero, Daddy, you're the hero." I looked at Ruth. She was coughing, her hands burnt, but she was alive. She looked at the ruins of the factory, then at me. She reached out and took my hand, squeezing it so hard her knuckles turned white. "The shoes are gone, Zium," she whispered. "We can make more shoes, Ruth," I said, coughing up smoke, "as long as we have the hands that made them." The police arrived then, not with sirens for a fire, but with handcuffs for a boss. I stood up slowly, holding my hands out. I looked at Zuri one last time, forcing a smile through the soot and the pain. "I have to go away for a little while, Zuri," I said. "But your grandmama has a new shop to build, and I'll be watching. I'll always be watching." The gates of the minimum security facility opened with a heavy, metallic clang. I walked out with nothing but a small duffel bag and a stack of letters I'd read 1,000 times. The world had changed. I was no longer Zium Jim, the shadow boss. I was a man who had served his time, a man whose testimony had dismantled the largest criminal organization on the East Coast. But as I stepped onto the sidewalk, I didn't look for a limousine. I looked for a flapping soul. Instead, I saw a sleek, midnight blue SUV. The door opened, and a young girl jumped out. She was 12 now, tall, with a grace that took my breath away. She was wearing a pair of boots that shimmered in the sun, deep mahogany leather with a gold double-loop stitch. "Daddy," Zuri yelled, throwing herself into my arms. I held her, the weight of the last 5 years falling off my shoulders like old skin. "Look at you," I whispered. "You've grown so much." "I'm the lead designer for the junior line now," she bragged, pulling back with a grin. "And Grandmama, well, you should see for yourself." I looked at the car. Ruth sat in the front seat. She wasn't in a manual chair anymore. She had a high-tech motorized one, but she chose to stand, leaning against the door with the help of new prosthetic braces my estate had funded. She looked like a titan. "The Mahogany Walk is the #1 luxury brand in the country, Zium," she said, her voice still like velvet dipped in iron. "We didn't just rebuild, we conquered." "I saw the magazines in the library," I said, walking toward her. "I saw the awards. You did it, Ruth. You made them see you." "No," Ruth said, reaching out to straighten the collar of my simple, cheap jacket. "We made them see us. The factory is waiting for you, Zium. We need a CEO who knows how to handle the wolves in the fashion industry, and Zuri needs her father to help her with her math homework." We drove through the city, passing the park where it all began. I looked at the bench, the place where a little girl asked a question that changed the trajectory of 100 lives. We arrived at the new headquarters. It wasn't a hidden warehouse. It was a glass tower in the heart of the city. At the entrance, carved into the stone, were the words, "For the ONES who were once invisible." That evening, we sat on the terrace of our new home. The relationship of convenience had evolved into something permanent, something built on the ashes of sacrifice and the gold thread of a conscious choice. Zuri sat between us, sketching in a new book. I looked at my hands, they were clean. No blood, no shadows, just the callous touch of a man who had finally earned his place at the table. "Zium?" Zuri asked, looking up from her drawing. "Yes, honey." "Why do the rich associate with us now?" she asked, a playful glint in her eyes. I looked at Ruth, then back at my daughter. "Because, Zuri, we showed them that the only thing more powerful than money is a story that refuses to be forgotten." I took a deep breath of the evening air. My name was Zium Jim. I used to be a ghost. But today, for the first time in my life, I was finally, truly visible. Success isn't measured by how much you take from the world, but by what you leave behind when you finally decide to walk in the light. We weren't just a mafia boss, a cobbler, and a girl. We were a family. And our story, well, our story was just beginning. The end.